This is Quinn Read, who is one of my favorite people. Quinn works with the Center for Biological Diversity. There you are. Hi, Quinn. Welcome back. So Quinn is the Oregon Policy Director for the Center for Biological Diversity. She works to protect and restore Oregon's imperiled species and landscapes. Prior to joining the center, Quinn worked as the Northwest Program Director at Defenders of Wildlife. Quinn also serves on Oregon's Environmental Justice Task Force. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Washington and a law degree from the University of San Diego School of Law. Welcome back, Quinn. Thanks so much, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Steph. I really appreciate it. And I'm so happy to be back. Please forgive me just a moment here while I click around on my screen to share my slides. All right. Okay, is that slide visible to folks?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. Again, my name is Quinn Read, and I'm the Oregon Policy Director for the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm talking to you today from my home in Portland, where I both live and work, on the unceded lands of the Chinook, Clackamas, and the Cowlitz people. I'm so thrilled to be back here at this fantastic event, so thank you all. Today, we're going to be talking about our recent efforts and some future opportunities to protect Oregon's wildlife from trapping. So I just want to start with some basics, really basic stuff. Animals suffer in traps. This is obvious, right? Well, having come off of months in an ODFW organized trap check times work group, I can tell you that it is not obvious to everyone. We were arguing about whether or not animals suffer in traps for, well, actually until the very bitter end, which was just thrilling. Nonetheless, animals do suffer in traps, and they suffer for a number of reasons. You know, in the best case scenario, and this is really saying a lot, best case scenario, an animal is killed immediately. Animals who are not killed immediately are left to suffer in traps for hours, for days, sometimes weeks. It's awful. Anytime an animal is caught in a trap, regardless of how long, they're subject to injury, shock. They could be subjected to overheating or freezing, just exposure to the elements. They can starve, they have no access to water, and all of that makes them vulnerable to predation from other animals who might be opportunistic predators. The longer an animal is in a trap, the higher risk all of these things are, the more likely it is for an animal to be subjected to any of these threats. Also, traps are indiscriminate. So, you know, I've heard many trappers say things like, oh, no, this trap it's calibrated to the specific quote unquote target animal. But the reality is that any trap on a landscape can injure pretty much anything, right? So traps can and do injure and kill lots of non-target animals. Pets, you know, cats and dogs end up in traps all the time, birds, and then of course, threatened and endangered species, including wolves. So there are lots of reasons why traps on the landscape are problematic and deeply inhumane. So let's talk a little bit about what trapping looks like in Oregon. Oh, and I should mention too, this little image you see here was drawn directly from the most recent trapping and hunting regulations brochure. And the last page is entirely an educational FAQ about how to tell the difference between coyotes and wolves, because in Oregon, you can essentially trap coyotes with impunity. Of course, you're not supposed to be trapping wolves, but it does happen. And so this is the agency's attempt to try to educate trappers. So it's hard to gain a full picture of trapping in Oregon. One of the big reasons for that is that trapping data is entirely self-reported, and it's just not tracked for many species. And then to add to that, for species whose populations aren't monitored really closely, and that includes Oregon's state animal, the beaver, it's really hard to determine the impact of trapping. Unfortunately, the default assumption by agency staff is, well, if we don't know that it's harmful, then it must not be. So we're not going to take action. It starts to look like a form of willful ignorance. And then, of course, a great deal of trapping in Oregon is carried out by wildlife services. And I suspect, everyone who's attending, this conference knows how hard it is to wring information from that agency. But here's a little snapshot for you. So I thought this was really interesting, and this surprised me. Trapping is treated like this untouchable legacy, along with hunting in Oregon. And it's true in many states. But we're really talking about less than 1,000 people. This is 1,000 people who applied for a fur taker license in Oregon in the year since 2020. So just like hunting, participation in trapping has been on a steady decline. But it doesn't really matter. The influence of hunters and trappers on policy is way out of proportion to their actual numbers. So in Oregon, there are 3, honestly, really arbitrary and overlapping categories of animals that can be trapped. So fur bearers are, the first category. And this is any animal whose fur has commercial value. It's a pretty gross way of looking at a living being. And this category includes beavers, bobcats, fisher, marten, mink, muskrat, river otter, raccoons, and both red and gray fox. So lots of animals fall into this fur bearer category. We also have this sort of weird amorphous category of unprotected mammals. And that includes badgers, coyotes, gophers, and others. Like porcupines, opossums are in that category. So that one's kind of a broad, kind of tricky one to decipher. And then finally, we have this category of predatory animals. Now, all of us here, we have an idea of what a predatory animal is, and it's drawn from science. In Oregon, a predatory animal is essentially any animal that farmers don't like. It's an animal that can cause damage to crops. So it includes things like coyotes, rabbits, rodents, and sadly, that means it also includes beavers and feral swine, so among others. So the other interesting thing about this category, and I'm emphasizing it here because we're going to talk about it a little bit later as well, is that whereas fur bearers and unprotected mammals are regulated by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, predatory animals are regulated by the Department of Ag. So basically, if you are a private landowner and you have a predatory animal defined by statute, causing damage on your land, you can kill with impunity. You can set out all the traps that you want. So it's a big, broad category, and it's really hard for us to get at because it's sort of in this broad program with the Department of Ag. If folks are interested, this is found in Oregon Revised Statutes, Chapter 610. And interestingly enough, this is also where the Wolf Compensation Fund is found. So there's this big category here of just farmers don't like these animals. So this is where we're going to regulate them. Let's see, just based on the numbers here, moving on, the most trapped species in the last biennium were muskrat, coyotes, and bobcats. We know that Wildlife Services does a lot of trapping to address the so-called damage. That also means we don't have a lot of information about how much it's happening, but they're out there all the time. They respond to thousands of requests every year to remove animals from private property. The interesting thing is, though they're responsible for a huge proportion of trapping in the state, they do have to comply with state regulations. So, although they're not really supposed to, they're supposed to be neutral agency, personnel, agency staffers can and do actively oppose changes to the state's trapping regulations. It's been a big problem. And then finally, fur bearer regulations are reviewed and updated by the Fish and Wildlife Commission every biennium. I note this here because this is a really important opportunity for all of us to advocate for change. All right, so let's take a quick look at some of the recent efforts to protect wildlife from trapping. Now, it's sad but true. Really any effort that falls short of a complete ban on trapping is really an effort to make trapping simply less inhumane. There's no way to make trapping humane. That doesn't exist, right? All we can do is make it less inhumane unless we're successful in fully banning it. So in Oregon, there have been some attempts to completely ban trapping. And this came in the form of a ballot initiative. It was introduced in 2014 and led by a coalition of groups called Trap Free Oregon. It was withdrawn from the 2014 ballot with the intent of bringing it back in 2016. And I don't know all of the details of why it didn't come back, but what my understanding is that polling has been really tricky on this issue. I think this might, surprise a lot of us, in this conference, but it's hard. A lot of times if you look at polling, there's a lot of sensitivity. And I think sometimes the trapping proponents are really good at stoking fears, particularly among folks in urban communities that, if we can't trap, our communities are going to be overrun with rats and mice and other pests and things like that. But it's pretty remarkable sometimes, the polling isn't necessarily on our side, with one big exception, and that's on trap check time. So even people who think, I don't really feel comfortable getting rid of trapping in its entirety, those people will still say, but if we're going to do it, we shouldn't let animals languish for long periods of time in traps. So that's where we had a little bit more success with public polling. I should also point out, this is also a big opportunity for public education, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do in educating the public and engaging people so that when we do want to come back with perhaps a more aggressive effort, we're better situated to do it. So anyway, that was 2014 and 2016. We had a big success in 2019 when conservation groups successfully petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Commission to ban trapping of coastal martins. I think it was the following year that coastal martins were officially designated as threatened, but there's something like less than 200 of these poor little critters left. So the commission said, nope, no more trapping there. So that was a big plus for us. But again, very focused on that one species in the coastal area of Oregon. In 2020, during the regular update of the fur bearer regulations, and this was kind of fun because, we looked at the regs and we thought, what should we ask for? What are some places where we could get some movement? So we asked the commission to do two things. One, to reduce trap check time intervals, and two, to ban beaver trapping on federally managed public lands. So unfortunately, we were not successful during that rulemaking process. However, the commission created two work groups. One specifically on trap check times, and that's the one that I served on that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. And then one on beaver management. So I'm not going to talk much about the beaver management group because it wasn't focused on trapping. And part of that is because beavers are classified as a statutory animal. So ODFW's policy is like, that's not under our purview, that's ag. Right. So until we get rid of this predatory animal statute, we're kind of on sort of shaky ground with what we can do in terms of beaver trapping. So let's see, in late 2020, the groups that were really, really involved with the beaver trapping piece, including the center, came back with a formal petition. And that was, again, unfortunately rejected. And, I think the commission said, we've got a work group going, we'll talk about it then. And then between 2021 and 2022, we had these work groups convene. And then just in June of this year, during, again, this the biennial update of the fur bearer regulations, the commission did in fact vote to reduce trap check time. So let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So what you see right now is a somewhat confusing table of what Oregon's trap check time intervals looked like. So you can see, depending on the category of animal and the type of trap, animals in Oregon could be left to languish in traps anywhere from 48 hours to 30 days. It's really upsetting and really gross. If you also look at it, I don't know if you all feel the same way, but the shortest trap check time intervals are for fur bearers. And part of the reason for that is because fur has value. So you don't want to leave an animal in a trap for a long time because the quality of the fur of the product could degrade. So in fact, fur bearers are among the best trappers in terms of checking their traps regularly, but it's because there's that commercial value. Now, if you look at that bottom row, predatory animals on private lands, a coyote trapped on private land could be stuck in a restraining trap for 7 days. If a kill trap, which is somewhat of a misnomer, because although the idea is that any animal caught in a kill trap would be killed instantly, it doesn't always happen. But an animal left in a kill trap could be left for 30 days. It starts to look like punishment, right? This animal doesn't have quote unquote value, economic value, and it's causing damage. And so we don't care if it suffers. It doesn't make any sense because none of this is based on animal suffering. None of it is based on science. It's based on these completely arbitrary categories of animals. And frankly, the convenience of the people doing the trapping and the landowners on whose behalf they're doing it. So during the trap check time work group, the center and our colleagues at Portland Audubon and Humane Society of the United States, we all advocated for a 24-hour or daily trap check time interval. So as I mentioned before, even this is too long, right? All this does is it makes trapping less inhumane. But 36 states have either a 24-hour or a daily trap check time for all wildlife. The majority of states have already gone this way. Oregon has been a holdout. It's a holdout on the West Coast. It's a holdout in the nation. It's very weird. Even the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, they instruct new trappers to check traps daily. The American Veterinary Medical Association recommends 24-hour trap checks. The American Association of Mammalogists suggests twice daily or even more frequently. So Oregon was way out of step with the rest of the country. It was felt really antiquated, but as an advocate, it felt like there's this, we're going to hold on to this as tightly as we can. And in the context of this work group, oh my God, I heard so many things that were just outrageous. I heard a trapper claim that trapping actually was the humane option because, see, the real issue was animal-on-animal violence. So by trapping them, we're actually sparing them from a horrific and violent death at the hands of nature. It was very, very strange. Other things that we heard were, well, okay, all of these other states can make improvements, but not here in Oregon, right? We've got a different landscape. We've got different weather systems, all of these reasons, none of which are terribly compelling when you think about how Washington has been able to reduce trap check times. California has been able to phase out trapping altogether. So a lot of stuff just didn't hold water. And then, as I mentioned earlier, up until the very last meeting, and I think we had 9 total meetings, we were still debating whether animals suffer in traps. We were trying to come up with a set of stipulated materials that we could present to the commission so that they could, enter into rulemaking. And when we presented, hey, we should say animals suffer in traps because that's the whole reason we're doing this thing, right? I mean, the whole reason we're revisiting the issue of trap check time intervals is to try to reduce suffering. None of the agency folks, none of the people from the Farm Bureau, from the Association of Counties, from the Trappers Association, not one of them would come out and stipulate the animals suffer in traps. So that's where we were after months and months of meetings and hours of, frankly, banging my head against my computer screen. So when we finally get to, by the way, it will come as a surprise to no one that we were not able to come up with any kind of consensus agreement to present to the commission. that meant that it was left to ODFW staff to do. And the staff member it was left to is the person whose title is Fur Bearer Coordinator and Conservation Program Coordinator. So why they thought it was a good idea to put those two things together is beyond me, but it does tell you, where their head was at. So after all of that talk, here's what they proposed. One change. So if you look at that bottom row, they said, okay, well, I guess, and this came directly from the trappers. This is the one thing they were willing to concede. For a predatory animal with a killing trap, we'll go from 30 days to 14 days. Now, this is effectively nothing. An animal caught in a trap that long has already suffered and is dead after 14 days. So checking it after 14 days does absolutely nothing to alleviate suffering for an animal that's not killed immediately by a so-called killing trap. This is nothing. And so we said as much during the commission meeting in June. And I don't know how many of you have sat through a commission meeting, particularly on a contentious topic, but it was fascinating to watch the back and forth on this. And I have to say, we were really lucky because we had, I think, one commissioner who was really pushing. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, at some point she had a dog who'd gotten trapped in a trap on the landscape and felt very strongly that this was an important thing to change. And so ultimately, what the commission did was move all predatory, basically change it to 48 hours across the board, except for the killing traps. So, as an activist, it's progress. I can't tell you that any of us were celebrating this for its own sake, but also just in light of everything else that was going on in the world at the time. But it's progress. And I think one thing that it indicates to me is that this commission in Oregon is starting to shift a bit. I think there's some more opportunities to move forward. I think that we can do some strategic things to keep moving the needle. I wish we could just do an all-out ban, but short of that, I think there's still lots of ways that we can start moving forward, and then hopefully in the process be educating the public. So I'm going to move ahead to my last slide here, which is upcoming opportunities and ways that I think folks here, if you're interested, could certainly get involved. And I will leave my email address so that anyone who's interested can get in touch with me and I can let you know as opportunities come up. But this predatory animal statute that I referred to earlier, we made an attempt to change this in the last legislative session and are going to bring it back this session. And I think we've got some good advocates in the Senate and in the House on it. So I think there's some good momentum moving forward. But if we can get rid of this predatory animal statute, there's a couple of really concrete things that will happen. First, all of those animals will return to under the regulatory authority of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, where it should be. Now, that's not perfect, obviously. ODFW is not, perfect by any means, but that's where it should be. It shouldn't be an ag. And then in terms of specific actions, this is going to open the door to, helping us regulate trapping for beaver. And it's going to help us do things like address coyote killing contests, which have been really tricky to do because they're technically a predatory animal. So it's been tough. So if we can get this through, we'll have a couple of other opportunities to address trapping and killing contests that I think will be really exciting and could really make some change. A couple of other opportunities. So looking at our success at banning trapping for Humboldt marten, we've got species like Sierra Nevada red fox, which are just, we don't have a really great sense of how they're doing in Oregon because we don't monitor them. If we don't monitor them, they could be totally fine. But there's, less than 50 of them in the Sierras, so they're likely in just as poor shape in Oregon. But we could do a petition to ban trapping of Sierra Nevada red fox. I think there's other species that would be similarly eligible. So doing more strategic, pinpointed things like that could help us get at the bigger picture. Then, of course, looking ahead, there's the 2024 update of the fur bearer regulation. That's kind of the big, wide open opportunity to say, here's what's wrong with this process. And then on an ongoing basis, there's this public education and outreach on trapping. We don't have good support at this point for a broad-scale trapping ban. So understanding why that is, and I think putting more time and effort into increasing that understanding and to educating people about the harm that trapping is doing on the landscape, particularly that perpetrated by wildlife services, which is just, I can't even talk about it without getting really pissed off. So, but there's lots of things that we can do here. So again, if anyone is interested in learning more, I'm going to put my email address up here and encourage you to reach out to me. And I'm just going to check. I think we're getting close to time here. So I'm going to conclude there. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thanks so much, Quinn. We do have a couple questions.
Yeah.
So let's see. Is anyone driving a strong push to end trapping in Oregon, as groups like Trap Free New Mexico, Footloose Montana, or Wyoming Untrapped are doing in those states?
It was Trap Free Oregon that led the ballot initiatives in 2014. And there really isn't anything major percolating right now. And a big part of that is the polling that I mentioned. It's like, when is the right time? The combination of public sentiment being behind us, plus the resources, because running a ballot initiative is so intensive. And frankly, that's what it would take. Theoretically, we could petition ODFW to do it, but that's not going to do anything and might do more harm than good. With a commission that's starting to feel like there could be some movement. So I think it would come down to a ballot initiative. So I think there has to be those two things in place, willing funder, with ample resources, and then polling that shows that it could actually pass.
We have a note here from Wyoming Untrapped. Says, I don't have a question, but just to note that the history being shared here sounds much like Wyoming. There is progress in our state, but the momentum is dreadfully slow. We'll continue moving forward for as long as it takes. Thank you, Wyoming Untrapped.
Yes.
Another question here is, you talk about the economic value of fur bearers. Can you speak to the true economic value that the fur industry contributes to the larger Oregon economy?
What's interesting about that question is that that's one thing I actually wanted to petition the agency to do, is provide a full accounting and audit of the value of the fur industry. And it's a little bit tough because there's, of course, the commercial fur industry. We've got mink farms in Oregon, quite a lot of them, actually, I think, which came to light because they were also sources of COVID outbreaks over the last couple of years. And then there's the trapping of native Oregon wildlife. But it's hard to quantify. And so I wish I had a better answer for that, other than to say that we need an answer for that, because I think that would belie a lot of the power that the trappers have right now. One of the things that we heard a lot in opposition was, I think, conversely, the economic damage being done to crops. So that's less about fur bearers than it is about coyotes and things like that. But we kind of want to have a better picture of both sides of that, because we just don't have good numbers. And with only 1,000 fur bearer trappers or fur takers in the state, it's hard to see how that's making any kind of I shudder to use the word meaningful, but meaningful contribution to the state's economy.
Thank you. A follow-up question to that, and you kind of touched on this already, but how do we get the public involved to end trapping in Oregon? How do we get the word out there? Less than 1,000 trappers holding the entire state hostage makes no sense.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things, First would probably be investing in some updated polling. So there was a lot of polling, done surrounding those ballot initiatives, but things have changed, so I think it would be worth doing some updated polling, and then using that to help tailor some educational messages, figure out what demographics are with us. I was looking at the polling data that Lynn was showing and how detailed the breakdowns were. So I think doing that kind of thing here would be very helpful. But keeping it in the news, it's not something that's talked about a lot. What happens is, I think it tends to come in these waves. The commission is scheduled to do its fur bearer regulations, and then all of a sudden there's this big momentum to address it, rather than a steady outreach and educational approach. So I think there's a lot of things we could be doing. Just getting more data so that we can be telling people the real toll. I mean, the previous question about the costs and the benefit, the economic benefits, understanding that, I think, would help us educate folks too.
All right, well, there's just some comments in here saying, thanks so much for your presentation. Great updated info. Yeah, if there's any other questions, though, feel free to contact Quinn. Her contact's right there on the screen for you. And we will conclude it there and let folks go to lunch. Quinn, thank you so much. And we will follow up with you here shortly.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, Quinn.